Good afternoon, Sunday afternoon, 3 o'clock p.m. I'm excited about seeing you again. Thanks so much for coming in and sharing with me. I am T.R. Coverson. I am the host of Masculinity, Blessing or Curse. I like to talk about this whole idea of bridging generations and causing us, particularly men, to get back on the path that Jesus Christ left for us. Today I want to talk about something that came up a few weeks ago that seems like there was a lot of interest in. And it kind of started with the idea, a subject of why men hate going to church. And that was one that got a lot of traction relative to your interest to it. I want to talk maybe part two about that if you could. It's not only men that we have seen a decline in their attendance to church, but it's also younger people. Often it's said in our church congregations that I had one guy say it this way. He said, my parents had a drug problem. Parenthetically, he says, yes, they drug us to church. Well, the environment that baby boomers grew up in was an environment that church was simply a part of your life. There was no option. There was no choice for it. And you simply went. And not only did you go on Sundays, it was often a part of your life. There were opportunities for Sunday afternoon services or evening services, or maybe it's a Lord's Supper or something like that done in the evening. Maybe there was Bible study on another night. There was choir rehearsals, prayer meetings. There were usher board rehearsals. There were all kinds of things going on during the week where kids were often involved in those. So the children's rehearsal usually meant that you finished your homework at school and you came to the church and you maybe even ate at church. So you grew up with those kids all together going to those various functions in church. And those kids became a part of your life. Often it was a case where the church was in your own community. So people didn't really have the transportation issue, maybe even walk to church. The children walked to church or what have you. So those kinds of communities became just a drawing force with the churches that grew baby boomer populations. This generation is different. In fact, I've heard people say, my parents made me go to church. I'm going to give my children the option. I'm going to let them choose. Well, I say that if you give a child the option of ice cream or broccoli, what is he going to choose? Well, that's my opinion. And yet, there is a necessity, if we're going to be truthful to this idea of the Joshua generation, having a conversation, an open dialogue, the Moses generation, having an open dialogue with the Joshua generation, you have to be able to hear where they are. What was not the case in the baby boomer generation was the exposure to all the kinds of media outlets that our children see. Or in my case, my grandchildren see. So that they have these other things that they may be interested in. There's also many parents have to deal with the other activities that children are involved in because they're on the soccer team, they're on the basketball team, they have dance class, they have swimming class. And so the parent, during the course of the week and even weekends, have the games, the competitions. And those parents that are now the millennial children, my children, my grandchildren, have all those kinds of activities going on. Now, that's the competition we have with legitimate attendance. But there is something else. I was having a conversation with another member of the church that was younger than me, young enough to be my son, actually, maybe even a little younger. But there is an attractiveness in many of the churches that are traditional churches for comfort, peace. Because if there's a senior congregation, they're not trying to do anything new. They're trying to maintain the tradition that has already been there, that I grew up with. It was great when I grew up with it, and so I'm going to continue it. Well, I often say there's this disease that children get right around the time that they become double-digited in terms of their age. This disease is called opinions. They start to think for themselves. They have opinions about things. And we have now the culture that we allow them to have a voice, their opinions. Now, in my day, your opinion is what your parents gave you to have, and you didn't have an opinion. Well, that's changed, so that children have an opinion, even as young as 9, 10, 11 years old. They have options. They're given options. And if we constantly try to bring them into an environment that is comfortable, that is peaceful, it's like sitting in their room without their video game. It has to be something that is exciting, adventurous. Jesus did not bring the disciples into an environment that they sat down and relaxed. In fact, he told them, there will be people that will have odds against you. They have odds against me. They would have odds against you. In the New Testament church, in the book of Acts, there was always confrontations. There was always something. They had to fight. Many of them were killed, put to death, hung, stoned, all of those things. There was not a situation where we sat peacefully and enjoyed services in the New Testament church. And so that kind of excitement, that kind of adventuresome, is what younger people are looking for. And if we cannot court that type of excitement, that type of passion toward doing something that excites them, gives them passion, then we lose them. We lose them. Because we have become comfortable in the things that we have traditionally embraced. And so what we start to see is a very steep decline in the traditional, in the black community, the Baptist, AME, Pentecostal, and Apostolic churches. An increase in populations in the non-denominational churches, because they do something that's different. In fact, many of the things that they do would just be frowned upon fiercely in the traditional churches. So, if we're talking about why men hate going to church, we also have to include why younger people are not going to church. And in fact, here's a caveat to add on to that. Why even young women are not going to church. We live in an age also where women have taken on a lot of the traditional roles that men had. And so they have taken on a lot of the traditional masculine tendencies to crave after adventure, competition, competitive veins or venues. And in the absence of that, I'm not interested, because they're there. We have to be able to communicate both ways, hear each side, and be able to adapt the Word of God to this present age. In the Bible, I talk about the Moses and the Joshua generation. There was an event where the Amalekites had attacked. Joshua's position was one of action. He was down in the valley fighting. Moses' position was on the mountaintop. He was there praying. Moses was doing the thing that he could do that was effective for the age that he was in. He could not do what Joshua was doing in the valley. And yet Joshua was not successful doing what he was doing in the valley when Moses got too tired to continue to elevate his arms up in prayer. We're both needed. It's a generation where right now we need Moses and Joshua to understand what we do in this present age. Right? Thank you for listening. Thank you for sharing with me. Please subscribe if you would, and we will look forward to being back with you next week. God bless. Have a great week.